on the best summer job I ever had. Best summer job I ever had was with my dad. My dad was the assistant county surveyor, which meant his job was to go out and find property lines, draw them out, make maps so people didn't shoot at each other. It happens. Just one summer, I got to go work with him because he was going to go up into this mountain area called Scare Canyon. Because the sheep owners and the cabin owners were having a fight, so he's going to go find the lines. I got to go walk around with him, mark the lines. I held the mirror so that he could shoot the laser to make the lines and all sorts of stuff. It was the greatest job because we got to hike all summer long. And the reason why they call it Scare Canyon was because when the settlers moved into the area, when they rode up into the canyon, their horses got scared. So they named it Scare Canyon. That's the only reason why it's scary. But as you walk down the paths and through the hills, the trees are tall. And as you come around bends in the hill, suddenly there'll be in front of you a moose pond. And the reason why they call it a moose pond is because sometimes there's a moose inside the pond eating. And they call it a moose pond. Well, this particular day, my dad and I were hiking around looking, trying to find a particular section corner. When we came around the corner on one of these moose ponds, but we didn't see a moose inside it. Sitting right in front on a big flat rock was a frog. Now, Scare Canyon gets cold in the wintertime, so if you see frogs, they're only really that big. But this was the biggest frog I'd ever seen. It was the size of a dinner plate, sitting on top of that rock, just sunning himself, getting himself all nice and warm. And I hit my dad on the arm, and I pointed at that frog, and he looked down, and he said, "That's the biggest frog I've ever seen. Never seen anything like that up here." And we began to discuss amongst ourselves how a frog got to be that big in Scare Canyon. We thought about, maybe it was released by somebody else, or maybe it just knew a warm place to hide in the wintertime. But as we discussed it, we heard a sound that you listen for when you're up in the mountains. It sounded like this. It was the sound of a rattlesnake. And we looked around, tried to find it, make sure we didn't step on it. As we were looking, we saw it. It was coming out of the grass by that moose pond up behind that rock where that frog was sitting. And my dad said, "Well, it doesn't matter how that frog got to be that big. He's seen his last day. That snake's found himself one nice lunch." I said, "I don't know about that. I don't know about that. You don't get to be a frog that big in these parts without knowing a thing or two. I might be a little more concerned for that snake if I were you." My dad said, "Frogs don't eat snakes." I said, "That one could." So we made a bet between the two of us. Now, my mama doesn't let us bet money, so we bet each other chocolate sundaes. I bet that that frog was going to eat that snake, and he bet that snake was going to eat that frog. And we shook on it. We looked down there at that scene, and just as we looked down there, we saw just in time that snake coil up. Get ready? Kind of opened its mouth a couple of times. And as fast as you could possibly think, at the exact same moment, as fast as you could possibly think, that snake shot up and grabbed the hind leg of that frog. And that frog shot out its tongue, grabbed the rattles of that snake, and sucked it into its mouth. And I looked at my dad, and my dad looked back at me, and we looked back down there at that scene, and we just saw that snake go and swallow the hind leg of that frog. And we saw that frog go and swallow 2 inches of that snake. And I looked at my dad, and my dad looked back at me. We looked back down there at that scene, and that snake had worked its way around and swallowed the other hind leg of that frog. And that frog had sucked in another 2 inches of that snake. And I looked at my dad, and my dad looked back at me. We looked back down there at that scene, and that snake had worked its way up, so it was right behind the head of that frog. And that frog had worked its way up, so it was right behind the head of that snake. And I looked at my dad, and my dad looked back at me. We looked back down there at that scene, and all we could see of that snake was its lips sticking out of the mouth of that frog. And all we could see of that frog was his lips sticking out of the mouth of that snake. And I looked at my dad, and my dad looked back at me. We looked back down there at that scene and they were both gone. They were just completely gone. All it was an empty rock sitting in front of that moose pond up there in Scare Canyon. Well, I looked at my dad. My dad looked back at me. We walked back to the truck, drove it into town, drove right up to Charlie's Ice Cream and bought each other chocolate sundaes. Thanks.